"Will you stay, human?" she asked. His reply left the alien Speechel Jackson's boots hit the soft, moss-covered ground with a muted thud. The dense jungle of the alien planet stretched out in every direction, with towering trees that looked more like gigantic stone structures than plants. Strange creatures rustled in the underbrush, their eyes glowing in the dim light filtering through the thick canopy above. The air was heavy, thick with moisture and the scent of unfamiliar flowers. It was hot, uncomfortably so, but Jackson couldn't afford to let it distract him. He had to keep moving. His ship, the Vanguard, was in pieces somewhere deep in the jungle after a vicious ambush. Pirates. They had torn through his ship's defenses with ease, leaving Jackson with nothing but his survival skills and a damaged communicator. The pirates had probably assumed he was dead, but Jackson wasn't the kind of man to give up that easily. He had been trained to survive. He scanned the dense jungle, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade strapped to his side. There had to be some kind of civilization here. A settlement, perhaps, or something more, he had no idea. The stars above him, unfamiliar and scattered in strange patterns, gave no comfort. This planet had no name, at least none Jackson recognized, but he was determined to find a way out. As he ventured deeper into the jungle, the sounds of strange creatures grew louder, their calls echoing in the humid air. Jackson kept his wits about him, his senses heightened. He wasn't alone, he could feel it. Then through the tangled vines and branches he saw it, a structure. At first he thought it was just another part of the jungle's bizarre landscape, but it was too angular, too perfect in its symmetry. It had to be a building. Cautiously, Jackson approached, his hand tightening around the hilt of his weapon. The building was made of stone, smooth and dark, as though carved from the rock itself. It towered above him, easily twice the height of any tree in the jungle. Its surface was covered in strange markings, some glowing faintly, but they didn't seem to be any language Jackson recognized. He was close now, too close to turn back. He stepped up to the entrance, a massive archway half overgrown with vines. Inside it was dark and the air felt even heavier. There was no sound, no movement, just the stillness of the unknown. Jackson hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped inside. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, casting an eerie glow that flickered with the rhythm of his heartbeat. As he moved further in, the atmosphere changed. He felt as if something or someone was watching him. He wasn't alone, and then he saw her. She appeared from the shadows, standing tall and regal. Her skin shimmered in the dim light, glowing faintly with intricate silver markings. Her eyes, large and alien, were the color of a deep, endless abyss, glowing with an almost supernatural light. She wore a simple robe that hugged her slender form, but there was no mistaking her presence. She was otherworldly. Jackson froze, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but before he could draw it, she spoke. "Who are you?" Her voice was soft, yet commanding, with an edge that made Jackson's heart race. It was a question, but not one asked out of curiosity. It was a challenge. "Jackson," he replied, his voice steady despite the surreal situation. "I'm lost. My ship was destroyed." The woman, alien, human-like in some ways, but entirely different in others, studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing, as though she could see through him. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was in the presence of something ancient, something far beyond the reaches of humanity's understanding. "Lost," she repeated, her tone almost amused. "What is it you hope to find here?" Jackson shrugged. "A way out." "I'm not planning on staying long." The alien's expression didn't change, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. "You won't be leaving," she said, stepping closer. "Not unless you can prove you are worthy." Jackson's hand hovered near his blade. Worthy? Worthy of what? Before he could ask, the alien spoke again, her voice low and almost soothing. "Tell me, human, will you stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Jackson blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Stay? Was she offering him refuge, or was this some kind of trap? He took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The room seemed to grow even more silent, as if the very walls were waiting for his response. "I'll stay," he said finally, his voice calm, though his heart was racing. "If you want me to." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through the alien's gaze. Surprise? Amusement? Jackson couldn't be sure. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were some kind of puzzle. "You would stay for me?" Her voice was soft now, almost curious, as though the idea of a human staying willingly was something foreign to her. Jackson nodded. "If you need help, then yes, I'll stay." The alien's gaze never wavered, but there was something in her eyes now that made Jackson wonder if she had been waiting for this moment for far longer than she let on. After a long pause, she stepped back, her presence commanding but not hostile. "Very well," she said, her voice still soft but with an air of finality. "Stay, but know this, human, nothing on this world is what it seems, not even me." Jackson didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed silent, watching as she turned and walked deeper into the temple, her movements graceful and purposeful. The glow from the walls seemed to follow her, as though the very structure of the place was alive. He followed her, cautiously at first, then with more confidence as his curiosity overcame his wariness. There was something about her, something captivating, something that drew him in despite the unknowns that surrounded them. As they walked deeper into the temple, Jackson couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than a simple rescue mission. There was a story here, hidden within the walls of this alien structure. And whether he was ready for it or not, Jackson had already stepped into it. The alien woman led him to a chamber at the heart of the temple. It was vast, with a high ceiling and walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to tell the history of a people long forgotten. The air inside was cooler, and the faint glow of the stone markings gave the place an almost ethereal quality. She stopped in the center of the room, turning to face him. Her eyes never left his. "There is much you do not understand, human," she said softly, almost as if to herself. "But you will learn." Jackson stood in the doorway, staring at her, feeling an odd sense of awe mixed with uncertainty. He didn't know what kind of future lay ahead of him on this strange world, but for the first time since his crash, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He would stay just as he had promised. The chamber was silent, save for the soft hum of something ancient and hidden deep within the walls. Jackson stood still, watching the alien woman Lyra, as she had introduced herself, turn away and face a large stone altar in the center of the room. The air was thick with an almost tangible weight. Everything felt like it was waiting for something to happen. "I've been here a long time," Lyra said suddenly, her voice soft but carrying a weight of sadness that made Jackson take a step closer without thinking. "I was supposed to be rescued, but that was long ago, my people. They never came." Jackson remained silent, not sure how to respond. What did you say to someone who had been stranded for so long with no hope of rescue? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going anywhere unless she told him to. He looked around the room again. The walls were covered in symbols, carvings so old that their meaning was lost to time. Some of them seemed to glow faintly, casting a soft light that made the room feel alive. It was as though the very stones were watching them, waiting for something, just like Lyra. "Why me?" he asked. His voice was steady, though a sense of uncertainty lingered. "Why would you want me to stay?" Lyra's head turned slightly, just enough for him to catch the glimmer in her eyes. "Because you're different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're human." Jackson wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he wasn't about to press her further. Not yet. There was something about her, a quiet power that drew him in, something ancient and fierce that he couldn't explain. He wanted to learn more, but something told him that doing so would only make him question everything he thought he knew. "We need to leave," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The enemies who destroyed my people, who destroyed this place, they're still out there." Jackson's eyes widened slightly. He had assumed she was the last of her kind. But the way she spoke of her enemies, of the ones who had destroyed her world, made him realize how much he didn't know. "Who are they?" he asked. "They are a race known as the Varkari," Lyra replied, her tone colder now. "They came from the stars like you, but unlike your kind, they did not come to help. They came to conquer. My people tried to fight them off, but we were outnumbered, outgunned. They wiped us out, leaving nothing but ruins." Jackson felt a pang of sympathy for her, but he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded. "What can we do? How do we stop them?" Lyra turned and walked toward one of the walls, placing her hand on the surface. The glowing symbols shifted and pulsed, as though responding to her touch. Jackson stepped closer, watching her closely. The symbols on the wall seemed to rearrange themselves, forming a map of the planet or perhaps something bigger. "I have a plan," she said, her voice resolute. "But I can't do it alone." Jackson looked at her, noticing the hint of something vulnerable behind her strong exterior. She was alone, truly alone, and had been for so long. She needed help, but so did he. "I'll help you," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could fully process them. Something about the way she carried herself, the weight of her history, made him want to stay, to help her achieve what she had once thought impossible. Lyra turned to him, her gaze steady, appraising. "I knew you would," she replied, almost to herself. "There's more to you than meets the eye." Jackson didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning, but he didn't care. He had a feeling that this would change everything for him. Everything he had known about survival, about the universe, it was all going to shift with this one decision. "I need you to trust me," Lyra continued, her eyes serious now. "The Varkari are still hunting for me. They want to finish what they started. If we don't stop them, they will come for you too. They don't care about human life. You're just another species to them, another planet to take." Jackson swallowed hard. He had always known space was dangerous, that every planet in the galaxy was a potential threat. But he hadn't expected to become involved in something like this. He hadn't expected to be swept up in a struggle far beyond his own survival. "I trust you," he said, his voice unwavering. "What's the plan?" Lyra looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "There's an ancient artifact hidden on this planet. It's the key to defeating the Varkari, to stopping them from destroying everything. I've spent years trying to find it, but the Varkari have already taken control of most of the planet's surface. We have to find it before they do." Jackson nodded. "Where do we start?" Lyra glanced at the glowing symbols again, her eyes narrowing as she traced the map on the wall. "There's an old temple deep in the northern mountains. The artifact is said to be hidden there. But it won't be easy. The Varkari have already begun to search for it. We'll need to move quickly." Jackson didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." The two of them set off, heading for the northern mountains with only the faint glow of the symbols to guide them. As they made their way through the jungle, the landscape began to change. The air grew colder and the trees grew sparse, replaced by jagged rocks and cliffs. The jungle was still alive with the sounds of strange creatures, but now there was a new sense of urgency in the air. They walked in silence for hours, each lost in their own thoughts. Jackson couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they failed. What would happen if they couldn't find the artifact in time? Would the Varkari finally succeed in wiping out another species? As they neared the base of the mountain range, Lyra turned to him. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of something beneath it, something that told Jackson she wasn't entirely sure of the answer herself. Jackson didn't have time to think about it. "I'm ready." Lyra nodded, and the two of them began their ascent, climbing the rocky path that led up into the heart of the mountains. It was a long and difficult journey, the air growing thinner as they climbed higher, but they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. The further they climbed, the more Jackson realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about saving a world, saving a species, saving more than just Lyra. It was about protecting the future. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the entrance of the temple. It was hidden behind a waterfall, its entrance carved into the rock face itself. The door was covered in ancient symbols, the same glowing markings that adorned the walls of the chamber they had left behind. Lyra stepped forward and placed her hand on the door. It responded immediately, the symbols shifting and rearranging as the door slowly began to open. The darkness beyond was overwhelming, but Lyra didn't hesitate. She stepped inside and Jackson followed. The air inside the temple was cold and still, the silence almost deafening. But they couldn't afford to waste time. They had come too far to turn back now. As they moved deeper into the temple, Jackson's mind raced. What would they find in here? And how would they defeat the Varkari once and for all? Only time would tell. The inside of the temple was darker than Jackson had expected, the only light coming from the faint glow of the symbols etched into the walls. The temperature had dropped, and a thick silence filled the air, broken only by their footsteps as they moved deeper into the heart of the ancient structure. It felt like they were walking through a forgotten world, a place where time had stopped. Lyra led the way, her steps sure and steady despite the darkness. Jackson followed closely, his senses heightened. Every creak of the stone beneath their feet, every distant echo made him feel as though something or someone was watching them. He knew better than to let his guard down. The Varkari could be anywhere. "This place was once a sanctuary," Lyra said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "A place where my people kept their knowledge, their history, but now it's just a tomb." Jackson glanced at her, noticing the sadness in her eyes. She hadn't spoken much about her people since their conversation in the chamber earlier. It was clear that whatever had happened here still haunted her, a wound that time had not healed. Do you think we'll find it here? Jackson asked, his voice low as they passed under a massive archway, the stone pillars on either side covered in thick vines. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the wall as she studied the symbols that covered it. The markings glowed faintly under her touch, shifting as though they were alive, responding to her presence. I hope so, she said at last. The artifact is said to be hidden deep within the temple, but it won't be easy to reach. Jackson's eyes narrowed. Why, what's stopping us? Lyra turned to face him, her expression serious. The temple was built to protect the artifact. It's not just hidden, it's guarded. There are traps in this place, designed to keep out anyone who isn't worthy. Jackson gripped his weapon tighter, ready for whatever lay ahead. He had faced danger before, but something about this temple felt different. The air was thick with ancient power, and every step they took felt like a step further into the unknown. They continued deeper into the temple, following the winding passageways that twisted and turned like a labyrinth. The further they went, the more the walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder, heavier. The silence was almost suffocating. Then, without warning, the floor beneath their feet shifted. Jackson's heart raced as the ground began to tremble, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoing through the chamber. He reached for Lyra's arm, pulling her back as the floor beneath them cracked open. A large stone platform rose from the ground, blocking their path. It was massive, easily twice the size of any normal stone door, and covered in more glowing symbols. The platform hummed with energy, the markings on it pulsing with a strange rhythm. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, her eyes fixed on the platform. This is it, she said, her voice a whisper. The first test. Jackson glanced around, trying to spot any signs of danger. The room was eerily quiet, but he knew that didn't mean it was safe. What do we do now? Lyra stood still for a moment, her gaze focused on the platform. We have to solve the riddle, she said softly, almost to herself. Only then will the path open. Jackson raised an eyebrow. A riddle? You're kidding, right? Lyra gave him a small, sad smile. It's the only way. The platform's symbols shifted again, revealing a series of intricate patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. As Jackson stared at them, the symbols seemed to blur and rearrange, forming a new image, a riddle. It was simple, yet complicated in its own way. The symbols appeared to be a sequence of shapes, each one more complex than the last. It was like a puzzle, and Jackson could feel the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. Lyra's voice broke the silence. The riddle speaks of balance, she explained, her eyes narrowing as she studied the symbols. Of harmony between the elements, fire, water, earth, air, each one must be aligned perfectly to reveal the next path. Jackson didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing: this wasn't going to be easy. He stepped forward, studying the symbols carefully. The shapes seemed to move, shifting and changing as if they were alive. He could feel the weight of the riddle pressing on him, and for a moment he wondered if he was in over his head. But then, something clicked. He reached out and touched one of the symbols, and to his surprise, it responded. The symbol shifted under his touch, revealing a new set of patterns. Lyra's eyes widened in recognition. You did it, she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. But there's more. Jackson stepped back, taking a breath as he looked at the newly revealed symbols. They were even more intricate than the last set, their designs more complex, their patterns more challenging. He had no idea how long it would take to solve this puzzle, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let Lyra down. He was in this now, fully committed to the journey ahead. The symbols seemed to taunt him, their movements almost mocking, as if they knew he was still struggling to understand them. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle with the knowledge he had. He knew that each symbol represented something more than just a shape. They were a language that had been lost to time, but one that he had to understand if he was going to help Lyra. I think I get it, he said finally, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. It's about patience and understanding how everything fits together. Lyra nodded. Yes, you're beginning to see. Jackson stepped forward again, focusing on the symbols as he carefully placed his hand on each one. Slowly but surely, he aligned them, his movements deliberate and measured. The air seemed to hum with energy as the symbols shifted into place, their glow intensifying. With a final touch, the last symbol fell into place, and the platform in front of them rumbled to life. The ground shook again, and the massive stone door that had blocked their path slowly began to rise. Lyra stepped forward, a sense of relief washing over her. "You did it," she said quietly. "We're one step closer." Jackson watched as the door lifted, revealing a long, dark corridor. The air was thick with anticipation, the unknown waiting just beyond the threshold. "Let's go," Jackson said, his voice filled with determination. Lyra nodded, her expression serious. Together, they moved forward, stepping into the dark corridor, leaving the riddle behind them. But the challenges weren't over. The temple was filled with more trials, more dangers, and more mysteries to unravel. And they would have to face them all if they were going to find the artifact that could save her people, and perhaps the galaxy itself. The path ahead was uncertain, but Jackson didn't hesitate. He would stay. And he would help her no matter what. The air in the temple was colder now, and the silence was oppressive. The corridor stretched ahead of them, dark and narrow, and Jackson could feel the weight of every step they took. It was as though the temple itself was alive, its walls watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Lyra walked ahead of him, her movements deliberate, but there was an unease in her that Jackson hadn't seen before. Something was different. The closer they got to the artifact, the more tense she became. As they walked, Jackson couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to come back here. What was so important about this artifact that she was willing to risk everything? He glanced at her, her face set in determination, but her eyes betrayed a deeper worry. "We're getting close, aren't we?" Jackson asked, his voice low as they moved deeper into the temple. Lyra nodded without looking at him. "Yes, the artifact is just ahead, but it won't be easy. The temple has defenses, traps that protect it." Jackson glanced around, sensing the danger that Lyra had mentioned. The stone walls seemed to loom over them, and the air felt thicker as though it was closing in on them. He didn't need to ask what kind of traps. He had seen enough in his time as a soldier to know that the path ahead wouldn't be simple. The deeper they went, the more the temple seemed to change. The walls were no longer smooth, but jagged, like the teeth of some ancient creature. The floor beneath their feet grew uneven, and the dim light of the glowing symbols began to fade, replaced by shadows that stretched unnaturally long. Jackson's senses were on high alert. He had been in dangerous situations before, but something about this place felt different. It felt alive, as though it had a mind of its own. Lyra's hand brushed against one of the walls, and the symbols flickered, glowing brighter for a moment before dimming again. She stopped, her fingers still resting on the stone. "This is it," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. "We're almost there." Jackson could feel the weight of her words. They had come so far, and yet the real challenge was still ahead. He had no idea what lay beyond the next door, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He moved closer to Lyra, standing beside her as she studied the wall with a focused expression. "This place," she said slowly, "was built to keep out those who aren't worthy, but the Varkari, they don't care about worthiness. They only care about power." Jackson nodded. "We'll stop them, we have to." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jackson saw something more than determination in her gaze. There was fear there, too, fear that she hadn't been willing to show before, the fear of failing, the fear of losing everything. "We have to do this," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "For my people, for everything they lost." Jackson didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the years she had spent alone, carrying the burden of her people's fall. This wasn't just a mission to her. This was personal. She pulled her hand away from the wall, and the symbols dimmed once more. She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm again. She moved forward, and Jackson followed. The path ahead grew even darker, the walls narrowing until they could barely walk side by side. The temperature dropped further, and Jackson could see his breath in the air. The stone beneath their feet was slick with moisture, and the shadows seemed to shift around them, as though something was waiting just out of sight. Then, ahead of them, a figure appeared in the darkness. It was tall, humanoid, but its form was distorted, its features hidden by the shadows. For a moment, Jackson froze, his hand going to his weapon, but Lyra didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Lyra," the figure spoke, its voice echoing in the stillness. It was deep and distorted, like something from a nightmare. Jackson tensed, ready for a fight, but Lyra raised her hand, signaling for him to stay back. "Varkari," she said, her voice calm, but Jackson could hear the tension beneath it. "What are you doing here?" The figure stepped forward, its face still obscured by shadow. It was tall and imposing, its body clad in dark armor that reflected the dim light like polished metal. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural. It was like the very air around it grew colder. "I could ask you the same question, Lyra," the figure said, its voice cold. "You should have stayed away. This place is beyond your control." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "I came here to finish what you started. You're not going to get away with it." The figure laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill down Jackson's spine. "You're too late, Lyra. The artifact is mine now, and once I have it, I will have everything." Jackson stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The figure's eyes gleamed from beneath its helmet, 2 points of glowing red light. "You're welcome to try, human, but you'll find that your efforts are futile." Before Jackson could react, the figure raised its hand, and the air around them seemed to warp. The temperature dropped even further, and a wave of cold washed over them, making it hard to breathe. Jackson felt his muscles tighten, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. Lyra stepped forward, her expression unchanging. She raised her hand, and the symbols on the walls flared to life, casting a bright, blinding light that pushed back the shadows. The figure recoiled, its eyes narrowing in anger. "Foolish girl," the figure hissed. "You cannot stop me, you cannot stop the Varkari." Lyra's gaze was steady, her voice unwavering. "I will stop you, and I will free my people." The figure snarled, and with a flash of movement it lunged toward them. But Lyra was faster. She raised her hand, and a pulse of energy shot out from her fingers, hitting the figure square in the chest. The impact sent the figure stumbling back, its armor crackling with energy. Jackson didn't wait. He moved quickly, drawing his weapon and charging forward. But before he could reach the figure, a blast of energy shot out from the walls, hitting him in the chest and sending him flying back. The force of the blast knocked the wind out of him, and he hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. Lyra's voice rang out, fierce and commanding. "Stay back, Jackson. This is my fight." Jackson struggled to push himself up, his body aching from the impact. He watched as Lyra faced the figure once again, her expression a mix of determination and anger. She raised her hand, and the symbols on the walls flared to life once more, casting an intense light that illuminated the entire room. The figure recoiled, clearly struggling against the force of the energy. It seemed almost weakened. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locked on the figure. "You will not take this planet. You will not destroy everything I've fought for." With a final, explosive burst of energy, Lyra unleashed everything she had. The figure screamed as the energy collided with it, its body shaking violently before it collapsed to the ground, its form disintegrating into nothingness. Jackson stood, his body still aching but filled with relief. He watched as Lyra slowly lowered her hand, her breathing heavy but controlled. The silence that followed was deafening. "It's over," Lyra said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," Jackson nodded, but he knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. They had won, but the war against the Varkari was far from over. They still had to find the artifact, and there was no telling what challenges lay ahead. But for now, they had won a victory, and that was enough. The silence that followed the battle seemed to stretch on forever. Jackson stood still, trying to catch his breath, his body aching from the impact of the Varkari's energy blast. The air around him felt thick with tension, but it was different now. The oppressive weight that had settled in the temple seemed to lift, leaving him with only the sound of his own breathing. Lyra stood a few paces away, her hand still raised as if she were ready to strike again, but the fight was over. The figure that had attacked them was gone, reduced to nothing but dust and fading energy. The symbols on the walls flickered and dimmed, returning to their quiet glow. Jackson finally managed to push himself to his feet, his legs shaking with the effort. He walked over to Lyra, who was still staring at the spot where the Varkari had fallen. There was a sense of finality in her expression, but also something else, relief maybe or exhaustion. He couldn't be sure. "Is it over?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had entered the temple, her gaze softened. "For now, yes," she said, her voice steady but tired. "But we still have a long way to go." Jackson nodded. He understood. The battle they had just fought was only one step in a much larger struggle. The Varkari were still out there, and their quest to find the artifact wasn't finished. But for the moment, they had succeeded. Lyra turned away, walking slowly toward the back of the chamber. Jackson followed, his eyes scanning the room as they moved deeper into the temple. The walls had begun to change again. The symbols on them were more complex now, more intricate, as if they were guiding them toward something, toward the artifact. "It's close," Lyra said, almost to herself. "I can feel it." Jackson looked at her, his curiosity piqued. He had never seen her so focused, so determined. He had seen flashes of it before, but now it was as though the weight of her people's history, of everything they had lost, was pushing her forward. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for them, for everyone who had been wiped out by the Varkari. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps echoing in the quiet temple. The further they went, the more the air seemed to hum with energy. The stone beneath their feet vibrated, and the symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their colors shifting with each step they took. Finally, they reached a large chamber, its ceiling high above them, almost disappearing into the shadows. The walls of the room were covered in more symbols, but these were different. These symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and changing in ways that Jackson couldn't understand. He could feel the power radiating from them, a force so ancient and overwhelming that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal, resting in the heart of the temple, was the artifact. It was a glowing crystal, its surface smooth and polished, but Jackson could see the intricate patterns etched into it. The symbols on the crystal were different from the ones on the walls, but there was no mistaking what it was. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locked on the artifact. She didn't say anything, but Jackson could see the mix of awe and fear in her expression. This was it. The thing she had been searching for, the key to defeating the Varkari, and the only hope her people had left. Without a word, she reached out and placed her hand on the crystal. The moment her fingers touched its surface, the entire room seemed to tremble. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light intensifying, and Jackson felt a surge of energy course through the room, through his own body. It was like nothing he had ever experienced before, powerful, ancient, and full of purpose. Lyra closed her eyes, and for a moment everything was still. The light from the crystal seemed to wash over her, surrounding her in a halo of energy. Jackson took a step back, not wanting to disturb her, but he couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about the way the energy seemed to flow around her, as if it were a part of her and she was part of it. Then, without warning, the light faded. The symbols on the walls dimmed, and the room fell silent once again. Lyra opened her eyes slowly, her hand still resting on the crystal. She looked at Jackson, and for a moment he could see the weight of everything in her gaze, the loss, the fear, and the hope all mixed together. "It's done," she said softly. Jackson walked over to her, standing beside her as he looked at the artifact. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. The power it held was immense, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just unleashed something far bigger than themselves. "We still have to use it," Jackson said quietly. "It's not enough to just find it. We need to take it back, make sure the Varkari don't get their hands on it." Lyra nodded. "I know, but now we have a chance. Now we can fight back." Jackson didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew what she meant. They had just taken the first step in a war that could change everything. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the artifact in front of them. Jackson felt the gravity of the situation press down on him, but there was something else, too, a sense of purpose. This was more than just survival now. This was about standing up against the Varkari, against the forces that had destroyed Lyra's people and threatened to destroy humanity. This was about making sure that their fight didn't end here in this forgotten temple. "We'll need help," Jackson said, his voice steady. Lyra looked at him, her expression hardening with determination. "We'll get it. We'll find a way." Together, they stepped away from the pedestal, the crystal glowing faintly as it rested on its platform. The temple seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for what would come next. But for Jackson and Lyra, there was no turning back now. The path ahead was clear, even if it was uncertain. They had the artifact. They had the power. And now it was time to finish what had been started. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning.